To the full House, the Judiciary Committee approves impeachment charges against President Donald Trump. We have reports from Capitol Hill and the White House. Big election victory. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson celebrates after a major win for his Conservative Party. Major milestone. Pope Francis celebrates 50 years in the priesthood. And a look back. Some of my favorite moments from my time at News Nightly as I say goodbye. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, December 13th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. The House Judiciary Committee approves articles of impeachment against President Donald Trump, one for abuse of power, another for obstruction of Congress. It's only the fourth time in U.S. history the committee has approved impeachment charges. It sets up a historic House floor vote next week. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi was inside the hearing room for this morning's session. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. That first charge, abuse of power, relates to President Trump asking Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden while holding up aid to the country. The second charge, obstruction of Congress, relates to ignoring congressional subpoenas.
All Democrats.
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Aye.
Of the House Judiciary Committee.
Mr. Cohen.
Aye.
Vote for the articles of impeachment.
Mr. Raskin.
Aye.
Half of the country has not been convinced after all of these hearings. They're not convinced. They think you're going to tear the country apart. What do you say to those people?
I want to say to them that you will survive. We will survive as a country. I hope that the divisiveness will be tempered by the fact that we are people of faith. I have faith. And I think that in having faith, you have to look at what your duty is. Your duty rises above the criticism.
All Republicans.
Mr. Gomer.
No.
Vote against.
Ms. Lesko.
No. Your article is agreed to.
Lawmakers expected the committee vote yesterday after a long debate that went into the night.
The votes were just 7 minutes. Why not just do this last night?
Well, the chairman will discuss all of that right now.
Was it a stunt?
No, it absolutely was not. We clearly didn't want to vote in the middle of the night.
Today's 23-17 vote sends it to the full House.
I doubt very seriously whether there are going to be any Republicans who vote to impeach the president. I just don't think the charges are warranted. If they were, we have a couple of our folks that have been pretty critical of the president over the years and probably would be for impeachment if he had done something impeachable. But he hasn't, so I don't anticipate any Republicans are going to vote for it.
The full House is expected to pass these articles of impeachment, then sending those charges over to the Senate, where Chief Justice John Roberts will act and preside over this trial, and the senators will be the jury, and members of House Democrats will actually introduce the articles of resolution, reading them aloud, and then arguing the case. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. President Trump describes today's vote against him as a witch hunt, scam, and hoax, and he's not letting it stop him from other business. Today, he announced a big trade deal with China. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The trade announcement took a back seat to the president's response to the impeachment probe today. He summed up his thoughts while visiting in the Oval Office with the leader of Paraguay.
This has been a wild week.
President Trump accuses Democrats of using impeachment to gain political points.
You're trivializing impeachment. And I tell you what, someday there'll be a Democrat president and there'll be a Republican House, and I suspect they're going to remember it.
The president must now prepare for Senate proceedings after his likely impeachment in the full House next week.
I'll do whatever I want.
The president says he's open to a quick Senate trial, likely ending with a Republican majority vote that would keep him in office, but he also likes the idea of a longer trial so he can attempt to bring in key witnesses to testify.
I wouldn't mind a long process, because I'd like to see the whistleblower who's a fraud.
Today, the president also commented on trade with China, announcing a breakthrough agreement with the country.
This is a very large deal, the China deal.
He tweeted, "We have agreed to a very large Phase 1 deal with China. They have agreed to many structural changes and massive purchases of agricultural product, energy, and manufactured goods, plus much more."
President Trump says some tariffs will remain, but penalty tariffs scheduled for December 15th will not be charged, and negotiations to begin the second phase of this deal will begin immediately. At the White House, Mark Irons, EWTN News Nightly.
The Senate has unanimously recognized the Armenian Genocide. It honors the 1.5 million Christian victims. The House passed it with overwhelming bipartisan support, 405 votes to 11.
Well, I think it's really important that we put on the record that we support that the genocide happened. I mean, when Turkey says it doesn't happen, that's just wrong. And we have to do the right things here and support what history tells us. And so that's why I co-sponsored it, and that's why I voted yes.
The House also recognized the genocide in 1975 and 1984, but not the Senate until now. Turkey slams Congress vote. Protesters rallied in Istanbul in April, marking the 104th anniversary of the Ottoman Turks' 1915 mass killings of Armenians. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson celebrates what he called the biggest Conservative majority since the 1980s.
This election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people. And with this election, I think we've put an end to all those miserable threats of a second referendum.
Johnson addressed an audience of cheering party activists in London today. His victory paves the way for Britain's departure from the European Union by January 31st. Our Rome Bureau Chief Alan Holdren sat down with Bishop Earl Boyer from the Diocese of Lansing, Michigan. Bishop Boyer was very open about Theodore McCarrick's investigation process and Pope Francis.
What was it that you spoke about with the Holy Father yourself?
Well, myself, I did ask about the McCarrick situation. That was really something that all of us were very interested in knowing where this is going. And I'm very glad to hear that a report is coming, and I'm not sure when it will be, probably after the beginning of the new year. And we expect that it's going to be like pulling a scab off. It's going to be tough, we know that, but it's better to get that out, get that done with. So it has raised mixed emotions in all of us. We want this done, and yet we know it's going to be painful.
Can I ask specifically what it was that you asked the Holy Father and what it was that he responded?
Basically just wanted to know where this was, because we had heard that there was a report that was almost ready, and so he described that to us.
And have you had the possibility of speaking with other departments of the Holy See about the same issue?
Let's see, we did talk, of course, with Cardinal Parolin, we did talk about it there as well, and he also assured us. He's a little more nervous about the reception of this in the public. And granted, it is going to be, as I said, like pulling a scab off. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And yet, I think it's got to be done. So we'll see how things go. And we'll just pray. I mean, this is ultimately for the good of the church. The truth cannot hurt the church. And I think that's important for all of us to recognize.
We hear about this division in the media. They want to paint the bishops of the United States in one corner and the Holy Father into another. Did you feel any of that?
I didn't feel any of that at all. In fact, I really felt kind of at ease, at home there. I really felt like he wanted us to be seen and heard as his brother bishops. And I felt that that was achieved. So I remember somebody mentioned from an earlier one, they felt his paternal presence. I felt more fraternal in that sense, that we really were brothers sharing these things. I thought it went very, very well. I was very pleased.
You mentioned in a radio interview earlier this week that sometimes it's a little bit difficult to explain what's going on in Rome, some of the decisions that are being made. How do you feel after this visit, and can you explain a little bit about what it is to describe things at home?
Well, I mean, I don't know that this visit's not going to solve anything as far as I know. But it helps me. I understand now that the Holy Father really is very orthodox, very solid in his own faith, and that came across to us all. He does allow a lot of confusion out there, and maybe that's his own background. I don't know where it all comes from, personality perhaps. But I think it's that difference between his own personal view and kind of what he allows that creates some of this confusion that exists. I doubt that that's going to change. I mean, I think that's the nature more of his personality.
Do you have a new way of explaining that at this point after this experience?
I think at least my own conviction that he is standing in line. He's in continuity. not in discontinuity. And I think that's important.
Thanks so much, Bishop Boyer.
You're very welcome, Alan.
Pope Francis met today with organizers and artists of the Vatican's annual Christmas concert.
Le orme di San Francesco di Assisi ho riproposto il presepe.
The Holy Father explained that Christmas is a time when we ask ourselves about our heart's desire. He said through our inner thirst, God Himself comes to meet us on the road where there is hunger and thirst for peace, justice, freedom, and love. The concert is scheduled for tomorrow. The proceeds will help the protection of the Amazon region and its indigenous people through the charity project Let's Network for the Amazon. Coming up, reaction after remarks by a Vatican official concerning assisted suicide. The president of the Vatican's Pontifical Academy for Life is making headlines for comments he made concerning assisted suicide. Archbishop Vincenzo Paglia said Tuesday he would be willing to hold the hand of someone dying from assisted suicide, and he does not see that as lending implicit support for the practice. Paglia told a small group of journalists he would be willing to do so because, quote, the Lord never abandons anyone. The remarks came at a press conference ahead of a 2-day symposium on palliative care. Here to help us take a look at this issue is Father Thomas Petri, moral theologian and professor at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also co-host of the Church Alive Saturday mornings on EWTN Radio. Father, welcome back to the program.
It's good to be back, Wyatt.
Since the Church does not support assisted suicide in any situation, what do you think the Archbishop meant by his comments?
Well, I think he's just looking to show that Christ doesn't abandon anyone. That's how he started his response. I do think, however, it was imprudent to suggest a priest could hold the hand of someone engaged in assisted suicide. It's still suicide. It's important not to normalize or regularize this as though it's some other medical treatment. I wouldn't hold somebody's hand if they were about to shoot themselves or if they were about to hang themselves. I would stop them, which is what a priest ought to do if he's in that situation.
How do you think we as Catholics should think about this idea of accompaniment? I mean, people are either close to death or thinking about killing themselves, unfortunately. How should we practice our faith around people like this?
Accompaniment should always be governed by love, and love is guided by truth, and so to help people who are despairing of their medical condition, their suffering, to let them know of our love and our care for them, but also God's love. And the meaning of suffering in a Christian context is that it's redemptive and that it's important that we allow ourselves to be dependent on others, to be cared for, to be loved, and to be well prepared, if it is a terminal illness we're suffering, to be well prepared to meet our Maker in the next life.
Assisted suicide, as you point out, is becoming more and more normalized in our culture, unfortunately. What do you think is the appropriate response from a Catholic who's dealing with someone like this?
I think to show a loved one your love and that you're really ready to care for them. You're ready to give them the care that they need all the way until their natural death occurs, even if it's a death from a very terrible and difficult pathology or difficult illness.
Because this can be difficult, especially when you're around family members who support it, but you're the one, for example, you may be the only Catholic or the only faithful Catholic who may say, hey, this is wrong.
Well, exactly, and I think at that point the Catholic simply has to say the Lord is the giver of life and He is the Lord of life, and it's not for us to choose to put someone else's life at an end sooner, and it's not for us to choose that for ourselves, that the Lord is the giver of life and only He can determine when our life is taken from us.
How does the Church teaching on assisted suicide play into the wider idea of the dignity of the human person?
Well, the dignity of the human person comes to us from God, and it's inalienable. So regardless of what we are, who we are, what station in life, what we can do, and especially what we can't do, our dignity remains because it's a dignity given to us by the mere fact that we're members of the human species and called to be united with God forever in the beatific vision. That doesn't go away. And so, unfortunately, in our country, in our culture, we tend to associate dignity with ability. The more ability, the more status you have, the more dignity you have. And therefore, when you're sick or bedridden and can't do much, it can be very tempting to think you have no dignity. Christianity says, on the contrary, your dignity has not been erased. In fact, you have more dignity precisely because we follow a God who became man to suffer. And so God redeems suffering and makes it dignified.
And of course, just as Jesus cared for the poor and the lowly, that's what we do as well.
That's exactly.
Really important issue, and like I said, not one that necessarily everybody talks about, but very happy to have you on to bring this to the forefront. Father Thomas Petri, moral theologian and professor at the Dominican House of Studies and co-host of the Church Alive Saturday mornings on EWTN Radio. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Up next, we'll discuss Pope Francis' impact on the 50th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood, and a personal note from me to you. Today marks the 50th anniversary of Pope Francis' ordination to the priesthood. He is the first Latin American and the first Jesuit pope. The Holy Father celebrated his anniversary at a book launch of spiritual writings from a fellow Argentine Jesuit and spiritual father to Pope Francis. Father John Dardis is General Counselor for Discernment and Apostolic Planning with the General Curia of the Jesuits. He joins us from Rome. Father, welcome into the broadcast. You have met Pope Francis several times, and as a fellow Jesuit, tell us a little about the Holy Father that the public doesn't normally see.
Thank you very much. Well, one time I met him that was very memorable was here in our Jesuit house in Rome, and I wanted to ask him to pray for a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, and she was dying of cancer. And I wanted to ask him to pray for her. So I passed him a little note because I felt I wouldn't have much time to explain everything. And I said, could you please pray for this friend of mine? And the way he listened so attentively, the way he looked at me was just so moving that that's one of the memories I have. Another memory I have is when I was in the nunciature in Ireland, in Dublin. During his visit there, he came for the World Meeting of Families. And he, in the nunciature, the same evening, was meeting with the survivors of sexual abuse. And he came into us after that meeting, into a group of Jesuits, and he is so obviously moved by that meeting with the survivors. And just meeting him at that moment, you could feel his warmth, you could feel his vulnerability, you could feel his humanity, you could feel his spirituality.
Sounds like two incredible moments that I'm sure, Father, you'll remember for the rest of your life. What does it mean to the Church to have the first Latin American Pope and the Jesuit Pope?
Well, a Latin American Pope, it comes at a moment of great importance in Latin America. Latin America is a continent with such a rich culture, such a rich church culture. It's in a constant state of flux, you could say, I guess like all the world at the moment. So having somebody who understands those dynamics of a Latin American church is very important indeed. Then as a Jesuit, he's somebody obviously with a great spirituality. The Jesuit, the Ignatian spirituality has given a lot to the church, especially in the area of discernment. Many other religious orders as well. The whole church has this rich tradition of discernment, right going back to the Acts of the Apostles, to the early church, to the early Christians discerning together. And Pope Francis really has enlivened that tradition, and almost every talk that he gives, every homily, he speaks of discernment, of listening to the Holy Spirit. And when you hear him and when you see how he works, for example, in the synods, you can see here's a man who really believes that the church is in the hands of the Holy Spirit, and that his job and that our job as Christians and Catholics is to pay attention to that Spirit, to listen to that Spirit, to be detectives, like detectives of grace in the world. Where is the Spirit at work? What's the Spirit saying to us? Can we tune into the Spirit in our personal lives, in the lives of the church, in our parishes, our schools? He fervently believes that. And that lets him go below, if you like, the politicization of the church, where some people want to say it's conservative or liberal or right-wing or left-wing. He goes below all of that discourse, and because he believes the Holy Spirit is the one who's in charge, and the Holy Spirit is the one who's leading us.
Father John, just to follow up on that, do you think the papacy has changed Pope Francis at all?
I think he's grown into the role so much. I think from the very beginning, he knew he wanted to reach out to people. From the very first moment when he appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's just beside us here, and he said, Buonasera. And then at the end of that, he said, pray for me. He's always asking people to pray for him. I think he's more and more aware of his own vulnerability, his need for prayers, his need for God to support him, his need for Mary to be there beside him. He's aware of all of that because this mission that he's got is so difficult, so complex. The church is so varied. The Holy Spirit is there for us and for him, but he's so aware of his own need for that Spirit and of his own need for the support of us all.
Sounds like a lot of really insightful information there, Father John. We appreciate your coming on to tell us a little bit about your thoughts about Pope Francis. Father John Dardis, General Counselor for Discernment and Apostolic Planning with the General Curia of the Jesuits. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
Finally tonight, I would like to take a moment to thank all of you, our EWTN viewers. This is my last newscast with EWTN News Nightly. Next week, I'm moving back to my hometown of Houston, Texas, so I can be closer to family, who I love and care about very much. Thank you for all of your support and prayers, both for me and for my colleagues. Being able to report the news from a Catholic perspective has been a joy. Here's a look at a few of my favorite moments while working for EWTN. I'm Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the East Room of the White House. In the last 6.5 years, I've had the privilege of reporting top stories from the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department. I've also had the opportunity to cover some of the biggest challenges facing the Catholic Church, like sitting down with James Grine, who opened up about his being sexually abused for nearly 2 decades by the defrocked Cardinal, Theodore McCarrick.
What did you say to yourself? That I must hide what is happening to me.
Most recently, I spoke with Vice President Mike Pence about the plight of persecuted Christians around the world.
The voice of the United States of America is heard all over the world.
But as great as it's been to cover the hard-hitting news, it's the lighter moments I'll probably remember the best. The sun certainly did shine. The students were set loose, a celebration of good old Dr. Seuss. I remember covering an attempt by a Maryland Catholic school to set a Guinness World Record for having the most people wearing a Cat in the Hat hat at one time. 600 people all in a line to set a world record, the greatest of all time. 600 kids all in a row, but let's add one more. That's me, ready to go. My colleague Mark Irons and I had a good laugh when we went to Red Robin in 2015 to try their crab cake burger.
I wanted to show this to the camera because this is, like, look at this.
This
is humongous. I don't know how is one person supposed to eat this?
That year, the food chain had invited Pope Francis to try their top Friday item.
How do you think they say crab cake burger in Italian?
One of the standout moments I'll probably never forget is interviewing George Washington at his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. How old are you going to be now?
Well, I'm well into my 60s, sir. How old are you?
Well, luckily I'm just 30, so I'm not quite there yet.
I have boots older than you.
I've had my fair share of laughs in the field and while anchoring in the studio. I actually have a Superman t-shirt, so I'm actually doing my best impression of Superman right now. You're wearing the exact same tie as me. The exact same tie, the exact same pattern.
Oh yeah?
Exact same. Why did you do that? Mr. Jason Calvinator Calvi, how are you?
Hey, Wirinator.
Hey, you at the White House, who are you? We're here about 150 feet above the ground. No matter where I've been, what I've been wearing, or who I've interviewed, one thing's for certain. My time at EWTN has certainly been a blessing. And once again, I appreciate all of your prayers and your support over the years. It's been fun, and of course, it's also been a privilege. Once again, thank you for watching EWTN News Nightly. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. And for the final time, good night and God bless.